Support comes from St. Louis Public Library Foundation, helping the library serve children and their families with programs and services needed to become lifelong readers. More information about the foundation is at slpl.org.
This is St. Louis on the Air from St. Louis Public Radio. I'm Elaine Cha. So far this year, more than 300 volunteers for St. Louis County's animal shelter in Olivet have spent nearly 28,000 hours walking dogs, cleaning kennels, and promoting adoptable pets. Despite their contributions, the county's Department of Public Health has decided to end the shelter's volunteer program. That decision follows an announcement in August that St. Louis County and the Animal Protective Agency, or APA, would be parting ways. And it has volunteers and advocates deeply concerned about what will happen to the animals at the facility, especially with the shelter's history of mismanagement and improper care. Department of Public Health Director Kanika Cunningham says the shelter will not look the same as it did in the past when the county assumes total control over shelter operations in late February of next year.
We need to make sure that we are operating the way that we need to. And a lot of times when you bring in volunteers, we need to have oversight. There's a lot that we need to do. I don't think that it will be fair to volunteers to bring them back into an environment in which we're trying to get ourselves on board or get ourselves up and running, to have a volunteer to be involved in us trying to reestablish our operations. And so that's a decision that I made. I do believe that once volunteers do return, that it will be a better program.
Volunteer Dale Shooter has donated more than 2,000 hours to the County Animal Care and Control Adoption Center, helping with tasks such as washing dishes, cleaning kennels, and walking dogs. She said she doesn't understand why volunteers can't be there to help shelter employees with the transition.
Our confusion is why they can't at least say, okay, we need a couple weeks to get going, and then we'll have the volunteers back in. And if we need to do paperwork, put that paperwork up right now. I'm happy to fill in an application, to set up a time to come in, do orientation if they need me to do another orientation. Although I feel like I've probably been in that building a lot more than some of the newer employees that are going to be coming into that building. And it's beyond me why they would not want us helping. Every major shelter within the metropolitan area has a volunteer program. People that are friends of mine, and even not even friends of mine, just acquaintances, don't understand why someone would turn away free help.
Now, to share more of what she learned about this story, we have STLPR reporting intern Ulaa Kuziez. Ulaa, great to have you on the show.
Thank you.
Now, what did the health department share with you, Ulaa, about the reasoning behind the county's decision to eliminate the shelter's volunteer staff?
Right. So this started late last month. The Department of Public Health was presenting a budget proposal for the county council, and that's where they mentioned that they will no longer be continuing the volunteer program. Someone on the Department of Public Health leadership team said the program has not historically worked. And so when I asked Dr. Cunningham, when I interviewed her, what that meant, she acknowledged that there had been tension and, a troubled history between shelter staff, county officials, and volunteers. And so she said when she restarts operations with this shelter, she wants it to be a better environment before the volunteers come back in. Mm-hmm. She wants to establish new workflows, implement new programs. And before bringing in volunteers, she wants everything to be set and ready. She did not give a timeline for when that would happen. And that is something that a lot of volunteers, as we heard Dale mention, are troubled by. They want a timeline for when they plan to bring back volunteers.
Mm-hmm. Now, in the introduction, we talked about the number of hours that these volunteers have spent to date, this year. What are Dr. Cunningham's plans to fill in the gaps with those thousands of volunteer hours now being taken away?
Right. I asked her that question. It is a lot of hours. And she said that she's confident that, the staff will be able to fulfill all the tasks and all the best practices that they need to operate the shelter. So they are budgeting for about 54 employees. Some of them will be new hires. Some of them have already been employed by the county that they just will be, transitioning into this shelter. That will include a vet. It'll also include a volunteer manager, an adoption specialist, and 27 animal control officers. Mm-hmm. And those officers, they're going to be key, Dr. Cunningham says, to really manage the shelter. So they will be splitting their time between the streets and the shelter in order to, take care of the animals.
Mm-hmm. I mean, did you get any indication as to how animal control officers, their whole job is to be out because they're responding to calls from the public to manage an additional duty?
Right. Cunningham says that she's met with these animal control officers and that they love doing outreach. They love being in the streets, but that they also want to be in the shelter as well. And so she says that by splitting up their time to be in the community, but also in the shelter, it'll actually help take away stigma that some of these officers have faced in the past from community members. And so that's one aspect to it. But she says, they will be able to manage their new expanded role, that they're excited to do this. And just to note that, in the budget meeting, the county or the Department of Public Health said that they will be paid about $24 an hour, and that is the maximum that they will be able, to be paid. And so, that's how they are relying, or that's how they hope the shelter will run, through primarily the animal control officers.
And then you mentioned stigma. What is that about?
Right. So the stigma comes from, people in the community thinking that animal control officers just want to take people's pets away. And so by putting them in these outreach positions, but also in the shelter where they are taking care of the animals, walking the dogs, the leadership in the public, the Department of Public Health says that will help remove some of that negative stereotype that these animal control officers have.
Right. Volunteers are a really big part of this whole picture because it's the discontinuation of a volunteer program. Ulaa, how many people currently volunteer at the shelter? And in speaking with several of them, what were their reactions to the news?
Right. So according to data from the APA, about 300, really closer to 400 volunteers are at the shelter so far this year, and they've like you've mentioned, have donated about 28,000 hours of their time. Now that's a really large number. And I spoke with several volunteers who are currently helping out at the shelter, but some who have helped out before as well. And they are concerned. They are scared that the shelter is going to go back to the way that it was before the APA took over. They're concerned that the dogs won't get their 15-minute required daily walks, that their kennels won't be cleaned properly. So they are concerned that the tasks just won't get done, and that will not only, be harmful for the animals, but it will also make them less adoptable. And so that means they're going to be staying longer in the shelter, they won't get out, and they won't be adoptable.
Right. And this is all happening at a time when animal shelters across a region and across the entire country, they're under a lot of pressure because they're either at or well over capacity. Now,
and I want to note that I also spoke to APA CEO Sarah Javier, and she has made the recommendation that the volunteer program continue. So it is not just the volunteers who have said that they want to continue helping out. It is also, the CEO who's currently operating the shelter who says that these volunteers are essential, and that the only way that the volunteers or that the shelter is as successful as it is because the volunteers are putting in these hours and supporting shelter staff.
Now, the St. Louis County Department of Public Health Director, Dr. Kanika Cunningham, does say volunteers will eventually be welcomed back. She didn't say when you noted some of the people who would be part of the staff. There is a volunteer manager and volunteer coordinator. However, there are some people who are feeling like this is deja vu all over again. Jenny Agnew volunteered at the shelter from 2018 to 2019, and she said that what's happening today reminds her of what happened in 2019 when volunteers were forced out of their positions and animal control officers and county employees were relied upon for dog walking.
Neither of those efforts in any way compares to having dedicated volunteers coming in every day, walking dogs, socializing cats, helping clean kennels, helping with laundry, helping with a little bit of enrichment that was allowed back then. So I'm concerned. I'm concerned about the animals. I'm concerned about the volunteers. And I'm concerned about the community because the animals will experience great deals of fear, anxiety, and stress. And ultimately, that makes them harder to adopt out.
Now, let's bring in someone who's got some backstory on 2019, and that's St. Louis on the Air producer, Danny Wicentowski. Danny, great to have you here.
Great to be here.
Now, Danny, you reported on issues at the St. Louis County Animal Shelter there in Olivet in 2019. Let's break things up kind of into chunks here. For those who are not up on sort of precedents in this case, what are the need to knows about what was happening between 2017 and 2018?
So there's some really interesting parallels between what happened in this previous chapter of the shelter and its leadership and what's happening now. Both of these sort of chapters include this moment of where volunteers are told, your role here at the shelter is being changed. We're taking a pause. We're taking a step back. In 2019, that led actually to them, I believe, actually ordering or banning these volunteers from being at the shelter, and they didn't return until later. But to your question, the big difference of what is happening now is that in 2019, this decision to pause volunteers happened after really a great deal of mismanagement and controversy over the county's running of this shelter. This was, if we are now looking at returning to the county running it, its previous shot at this really went poorly. There was a significant scandal where it was revealed that some really key paperwork that people were being asked to fill out or being told to fill out, even though they didn't realize it, they were saying that they were relinquishing the animal for euthanasia, even if those owners didn't want that. Mm-hmm. And this was something that the volunteers were seeing, that staff were seeing. I spoke to a lot of them at the time about how terrible it was to experience this, or the sense that they weren't being honest or being told not to be honest with the people bringing their pets, bringing their very important companions to the shelter. And a lot of these animals were killed and euthanized, and that data was then used and the data was manipulated, essentially, mm-hmm. to present the shelter as a no-kill shelter, as a shelter that, was deserving of all of this recognition and honor, and that all really fell apart. They fired their director. They ended up having to pay that director a settlement. And what happens is they tell the volunteers to stay away in 2019, and by the time the APA takes over in 2022, 2 years later, when the county has been essentially using its staff and using its available animal control officers at the time, things are not good at the shelter in 2022 when the APA takes over. They initially report, filth in the kennels, layers of feces, animals that have not been walked, all of the things that volunteers basically said was going to happen, and that reflected the incredible amount of labor and care, and the way that running an animal control department isn't like running a landfill, where you're just looking for issues that are problems outside, let's put them in one area and dispose of them. Volunteers don't see the animals this way, and a lot of them, when they talk to me, they represent this fear as going back to the old pound system, right, of where animals are really just problems.
And there was even a volunteer who filed a lawsuit, right?
So that's part of the fallout over the county's last opportunity to manage the shelter is still playing out. One of those shelter managers we actually talked to on the show a couple years ago, Mandy Zatorski, she's still suing that shelter for retaliation. Case is still ongoing. But a lot of volunteers have had this experience of where they have criticized the shelter, they have made their voices known, and they've either been, allegedly retaliated against, or they feel like they're not being heard. On the other side, I should say that the county officials I spoke with, several years ago about this, the animal control officers, they feel like the volunteers are often too critical, and they make their job harder because they are constantly looking at things that are not going well, and these are people who are giving a lot of their time. So there is an ongoing tension, and the volunteers, though, consistently have said these animals need to be walked. The amount of labor and the amount of cleaning and care and a sense that these animals are not just problems, you can't take that out of a shelter. You can't run it without that level of care. And the fact that we are now back here with the APA now leaving really brings all these questions back to the fore. What is the shelter for? What kind of people does it need to make sure the animals are okay? And is that the point of what the shelter is doing?
Right. So, Ulaa, in the introduction, we did talk about the announcement in August that the St. Louis County Department of Health and that the APA would be parting ways. So what is it that we know about why that deal was broken several years before its previously established end date?
Right. I posed that question to both Dr. Cunningham and APA CEO Sarah Javier, and they both kind of gave me some vague answers. Dr. Cunningham says that it is the responsibility of the county, of the Department of Public Health, to take care of the animals in the county, to operate the shelter, that it's their duty, and that they feel like they're ready to do it again, that the APA kind of did their role in transforming the shelter, that they've learned from them, and now they can, do it again. On the other end, APA's CEO told me that, they did their duty, they turned around the shelter, and they're moving on to other operations. And so they are fairly vague answers. I'm assuming that there's a little bit more there that we don't know, but that, bringing up all of this background, I want to say that, the Department of Public Health, the county council is aware of this history, and they say that they don't want to repeat it as well. They don't want to have the same issues. They don't want to be in the headlines. But the volunteers are saying that this will happen if they don't come back.
I should point out, when I was talking to these volunteers before the APA came on, there was also a lot of concern of what would privatizing the shelter be. A lot of this is a lack of communication and a lack of or a refusal, really, to bring the volunteers into the organizing process. And so it leaves a lot of questions unanswered. The APA really did turn this place around significantly, but volunteers are still kind of left outside the room where things are happening. And I think that's what feels very familiar about this moment.
Right. Ulaa, is there anything that you'll be watching for with this story? I mean, especially given all of the context Danny has provided with what you've heard from people right now. And I think this is an interesting conversation to be happening at a point in the year when maybe people are thinking about getting a pet for the holidays as a gift. I mean, what are the things that maybe you'll be watching for or keeping an ear open to hear?
Right. So the county takes over the shelter in February 21st. And so until then, I'll be curious to see if, the open positions are being filled. We don't know as of yet if the positions are nearly being filled or not. I'll be watching to see if the Department of Public Health changes their decision after a lot of this pressure, this backlash from the volunteers. And I think there's a bigger question that I'll be watching out for as well, is what is the role of a municipality or a government, and what is the role of a nonprofit, and why are these partnerships not working out in this region?
Ulaa Kuziez is STLPR's reporting intern, and Danny Wicentowski is a producer for St. Louis on the Air. Danny and Ulaa, thank you for joining us to talk about this today.
Great to be here.
Thank you.
This episode was produced by Emily Woodbury,
with audio engineering by Maya Norfleet.
Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations. And leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thanks.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
The Gateway brings you the day's news each weekday from around the St. Louis region and the state capitals in Jefferson City.
Our schools are accredited. We don't need this bill.
And Springfield.
How many more years must pass before lawmakers see time is of the essence?
I'm Abby Larico. Join me each weekday for The Gateway on the STLPR app or wherever you get podcasts.